Hearts of the Red Centre, a love story from the Australian Outback. The Australian Outback stretches endlessly beneath a merciless sun, its red earth baked hard as ancient pottery, cracked into 1,000 jagged pieces that tell stories of drought and endurance. Here, where the horizon shimmers like a mirage, and the silence is so profound that it echoes in your bones, the land tests every soul brave enough to call it home. In this vastness, where ghost gums stand like sentinels against the burning sky, and the Southern Cross watches over all who dare to dream beneath it, a woman walked alone. Her name was Margaret, Maggie to those who had once loved her, and she carried the weight of betrayal in her weathered hands and the ache of abandonment in her weary heart. 3 days had passed since her husband's utility truck had disappeared into the dust, taking with it 37 years of marriage, their life savings, and every promise he had ever whispered in the dark hours before dawn. 3 days since she had awakened to find nothing but a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table. "Can't do this anymore. Don't follow me." The homestead that had once echoed with laughter and the gentle hum of a life shared now stood silent, its corrugated iron roof groaning under the relentless heat. The water tank, which her husband had promised to repair, leaked precious drops into the thirsty earth below, each drop a reminder of all the things left undone, all the words left unsaid. Margaret had always prided herself on being strong. She had weathered droughts that killed cattle and floods that washed away bridges. She had birthed calves in the early hours of morning and mended fences until her hands bled. But this abandonment, this casual discarding of a life built together, had left her hollow, a ghost haunting her own existence. The heat pressed down upon her like a living thing as she struggled to maintain the routines that had once given her days meaning. The generator that powered their modest home had begun to fail, its fuel running low. The vegetables in her garden withered despite her careful rationing of water. Even the hardy succulents her mother had planted decades ago began to show signs of surrender. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed its merciless arc across the cloudless sky, Maggie felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had already shattered, but something deeper. Her resolution, perhaps, her will to continue this solitary dance with survival. She had been walking the boundary fence, checking for breaks that could scatter what remained of their small herd, when the world began to spin. The red earth rushed up to meet her as her legs betrayed her, buckling like old timber beneath a heavy load. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the endless blue of the outback sky, vast and indifferent as the ocean. But in this land, where miracles come disguised as ordinary men doing extraordinary things, help was already on its way. Through the shimmering heat, across the ancient landscape that had witnessed countless stories of loss and redemption, rode a man whose own heart had been tempered by solitude and hardship. His name was Jack Sullivan, and he had spent the better part of 15 years learning that sometimes the most precious things in life are found in the places we least expect to look. He had been checking his own cattle when he spotted the figure collapsed by the fence line, a splash of color against the endless red. And in that moment, though neither of them knew it yet, two broken hearts began their journey towards healing. The Outback had claimed another story, but this time it would be one of redemption rather than loss, of love found in the twilight of life rather than dreams abandoned to the dust. For in this harsh and beautiful land, where the strong survive and the wise endure, sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with bold declarations, but with simple acts of compassion. One human soul reaching out to save another. And if you find yourself drawn to stories of resilience, of hearts that refuse to surrender even when all seems lost, then perhaps you want to journey with us through this tale of love found in the most unlikely of places. Consider staying with us by subscribing to hear more stories from this remarkable land. And if this opening has stirred something in your own heart, let us know by sharing your support, for every story is made richer by the souls who choose to witness it.
Chapter 1. When the Earth Stands Still. The boundary fence stretched like a rusty lifeline across the endless red expanse, each post a marker in Margaret O'Brien's daily pilgrimage of survival. For 63 years she'd called this land home, first as a child trailing behind her father as he checked the same fences, later as a young bride learning to read the moods of the sky and the subtle language of cattle, and finally as a woman abandoned, walking these lines alone with only the wind for company. The morning had started like so many others in the 3 weeks since David's departure. She had risen before dawn, her body moving through the familiar rituals, even as her heart remained numb. Coffee made with water carefully measured, toast eaten without tasting, the small radio crackling with weather reports that promised more of the same. Clear skies, no chance of rain, temperatures climbing toward 40 degrees Celsius before noon. Their homestead, Mirraloola, sat like a weathered jewel in the vast crown of the Northern Territory. 200 kilometers from the nearest town and a lifetime away from the world most people knew. David's grandfather had claimed this land in 1923, drawn by promises of cattle fortunes and the romance of frontier life. 3 generations of O'Briens had worked this soil, loved this harsh beauty, and learned to speak the ancient language of seasons and stars. Now Maggie was the last of them, walking fence lines that seemed to stretch into eternity, checking gates that led nowhere but deeper into solitude. She had discovered the break in the eastern boundary just after sunrise, a section where the wire had snapped under the weight of a fallen tree branch, creating a gap wide enough for their remaining cattle to wander on to neighboring property. The Johnsons, who ran the adjacent station, were decent people, but lost cattle meant complicated conversations about property rights and compensation. Conversations Maggie wasn't sure she had the strength for anymore. The repair would be simple enough if she could manage it alone. She had helped David mend hundreds of such breaks over the years, her smaller hands often better suited to threading wire through tight spaces while his strength handled the heavy lifting. But David was gone now, taking with him not just his presence, but the comfortable rhythm of shared labor, the easy shorthand of a partnership built over decades. The sun climbed higher as she worked, its heat pressing down upon the red earth like a vast iron. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her back, staining the faded blue work shirt that had once belonged to her husband. Her hands, already marked by age and years of hard work, began to shake as she struggled with the wire cutters, the metal slick in her grip. The cattle watched her from the meagre shade of a cluster of ghost gums, their dark eyes patient but somehow knowing. These were animals that had learned to read the subtle signs of drought and plenty, of human moods and weather patterns. They seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in their world, that the reliable rhythms they had always known were breaking down, like fence wire under too much strain. Maggie paused in her work, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand as she gazed across the landscape that had shaped her entire life. The red earth stretched away in all directions, broken by the occasional outcrop of ancient stone and the pale green of hardy scrub that had learned to survive on almost nothing. In the distance, a wedgie eagle circled on thermals, riding the heat with a grace that made her heart ache with something she couldn't quite name. This was the land that had taught her about endurance, about finding beauty in harshness and hope in the space between one difficult season and the next. But now, standing alone beside the broken fence with the sun beating down upon her shoulders, she wondered if she had finally reached the limit of her own endurance. The wire slipped from her hands again, coiling in the dust like a steel snake. She bent to retrieve it, and that was when the world began to tilt sideways. The heat, the dehydration, the sleepless nights and barely touched meals, all of it caught up with her in a single terrible moment. She felt herself falling, the red earth rushing up to her like an old friend. Her last conscious thought was of David, not the man that had abandoned her, but the young stockman that she had fallen in love with 40 years ago, the one who had promised they'd face whatever came together, side by side until the end. The silence that followed was complete, the kind of silence that exists only in the deep heart of the continent, where the nearest human soul might be 100 kilometers away, and the land keeps its own counsel. For long minutes nothing moved except the wind stirring the dust around her still form and the cattle shifting restlessly in their patch of shade. But the outback, for all its harshness, rarely abandons its own. Across the shimmering distance, another figure moved through the heat, a horseman following his own fence line, checking his own boundaries in the eternal rhythm of station life. Jack Sullivan had been making these same rounds for 15 years, ever since he had bought the struggling property adjacent to the O'Brien spread and begun the slow work of bringing it back to life. He had known David and Maggie by reputation and occasional encounters at the monthly supply runs to town. Good people, the kind of neighbours who would share equipment during emergencies and offer help during the terrible seasons when the land tested everyone's resolute. He had noticed David's truck hadn't been seen on the main track for several weeks, but in country where privacy was both necessity and courtesy, such absences didn't always warrant investigation. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next Outback tale.
Until now, when his mare suddenly lifted her head from the sparse grass she'd been cropping and stood alert, her ears pricked toward the O'Brien boundary. She was a good horse, bred for station work and blessed with the kind of intelligence that could save lives in country where mistakes were often fatal. When she began moving toward the fence line without command, Jack trusted her instincts and let her lead. They found Maggie lying crumpled beside the broken fence, her grey hair spread across the red earth like spilled moonlight. For a terrible moment, Jack thought they were too late, that the Outback had claimed another victim to heat and isolation. But as he knelt beside her, his weathered hands searching for a pulse, he felt the flutter of life beneath her sun-warmed skin. She was alive, but barely. Her lips were cracked with dehydration, her breathing shallow and rapid. The work shirt she wore was soaked with perspiration, and her skin had the dangerous pallor that spoke of heat exhaustion sliding towards something worse. Jack Sullivan was a man who had learned to make quick decisions in a land that punished hesitation. Within moments, he had lifted Maggie's slight form in his arms and settled her across his saddle, supporting her weight against his chest as his mare picked her way carefully toward the homestead buildings visible in the distance. The ride seemed to take forever, though it lasted perhaps 10 minutes. He spoke to her continuously, his voice rough from years of calling the cattle across vast distances, telling her she was safe now, that help was coming, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. Whether she heard him or not, he couldn't tell, but the words seemed as necessary for him as for her, a bridge across the terrible silence that threatened to swallow them both. The O'Brien homestead, when they reached it, told its own story of recent abandonment and struggle. The yard, once neat and well-maintained, showed signs of neglect. Weeds growing between the paving stones, tools left where they had been dropped, the vegetable garden beginning to surrender to the relentless sun. But the house itself was still solid, its thick stone walls and deep verandas designed to provide refuge from heat that could kill. Jack carried Maggie up the front steps and through the unlocked door, calling out in case someone else was home. The silence that answered him confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that this woman had been facing the challenges of station life entirely alone. He settled her on the old leather couch in what appeared to be the main living area, then began the systematic search for the things she would need. Water first and foremost, then something to help bring down her body temperature and restore the electrolytes her body had lost to the brutal heat. The kitchen yielded bottled water and salt, sugar that could be mixed into a crude but effective rehydration solution. He found clean towels in a hall closet and soaked them with cool water from the kitchen tap, then returned to kneel beside the couch where Maggie lay still and pale as weathered bone. Carefully, gently, he began the process of bringing her back from the edge. Cool cloths on her forehead and wrists, small sips of the sugar-salt solution when she was conscious enough to swallow, constant monitoring of her pulse and breathing. He had done this before, for workers overcome with heat during the brutal summer months, and he knew that the next few hours would determine whether she'd recover fully or face the kind of damage that could last a lifetime. As he worked, he found himself studying her face, the fine lines that spoke of years spent squinting into bright sunlight, the silver threads in hair that had once been brown, the hands that showed the permanent stains of honest work. She was a handsome woman, he realized, with the kind of beauty that came not from youth, but from a life fully lived, from choices made and challenges faced with courage. It was nearly sunset when she finally opened her eyes, confusion clouding her gaze as she tried to focus on the unfamiliar face hovering above her. Jack saw the moment when awareness returned, when she remembered where she had been and what had happened, and he watched her struggle to make sense of finding herself safe in her own home with a stranger tending to her needs. "Easy," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to gentling frightened animals. "You're safe. You collapsed out by the boundary fence. Heat exhaustion. I'm Jack Sullivan. I run the property to the east of yours." She tried to sit up, but he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, encouraging her to remain still. "Don't try to move too fast. You've been unconscious for several hours. Your body needs time to recover." "The fence," she whispered, her voice hoarse as sandpaper. "The cattle." "The fence can wait," Jack said firmly, "and your cattle are fine. I checked on them before I brought you in. They're staying close to water and shade, like sensible creatures."
He helped her take small sips of the electrolyte solution, watching carefully to ensure she could keep it down. As color slowly returned to her cheeks, he saw something else flickering in her eyes, a wariness that spoke of wounds deeper than physical exhaustion. "Where's David?" she asked suddenly, and Jack heard the tremor in her voice that suggested she already knew the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I haven't seen his truck in some time," he said finally. "Are you out here alone?" The question hung in the air between them like heat shimmer, and Jack watched as Maggie's composure finally cracked. Tears that had been held back by shock and pride began to flow. Silent at first, then building to the kind of sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being.
Jack Sullivan was not a man comfortable with emotion. 15 years of solitary life had taught him to keep his own feelings carefully contained. But something about this woman's grief, raw and honest as the land around them, stirred memories of his own losses and the terrible loneliness that could consume a person in country where neighbors might be a day's ride away. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," he said quietly, "but you don't have to face whatever it is alone." The words seemed to surprise them both. Jack had lived as a solitary man for so long that offers of companionship felt foreign on his tongue, while Maggie had grown so accustomed to carrying her burdens alone that the simple gesture of human comfort seemed almost overwhelming. They sat together as darkness settled over the homestead, the generator humming to life automatically as solar sensors detected the fading light. Through the windows, the first stars began to appear in the vast dome of sky that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. The same stars that had watched over countless other stories of hardship and survival in this ancient land. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but something had shifted in the space between them. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that loneliness shared became somehow more bearable. Or perhaps it was the deeper understanding that in a land where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers, human connection was not just comfort, but necessity. When Maggie finally found her voice again, it was to tell him about the morning she had awakened to find herself abandoned, about the note left on the kitchen table, and the terrible silence that had filled the homestead ever since. She spoke haltingly at first, then with gathering momentum, as if the words had been building pressure behind a dam that had finally begun to give way. Jack listened without judgment, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift one person could offer another was simply the willingness to witness their pain. He had known abandonment himself, though of a different kind, and he recognized in her story the familiar rhythm of a life suddenly stripped of all its comfortable certainties. As the night deepened around them and the Southern Cross wheeled overhead in its ancient pattern, two solitary souls began to discover that rescue could take many forms, that sometimes salvation came not as dramatic intervention, but as the quiet presence of another human being willing to sit in the darkness and share the weight of sorrow. The fence would wait until morning, as would the 1,000 other tasks that station life demanded. Tonight, there was only the simple miracle of surviving another day in a land that asked everything of those who loved it, and the unexpected grace of discovering that even in the deepest loneliness, hope could still take root like hardy desert plants in the most unlikely soil. And so begins a story that reminds us that sometimes our greatest challenges become the pathways to our most unexpected blessings. In the heart of Australia's Red Centre, where the land teaches harsh lessons about endurance and hope, two souls have found each other in the twilight hour when all seemed lost. If you've ever wondered whether second chances truly exist, whether love can bloom in the desert places of our hearts, then stay with us as this story unfolds. Consider subscribing to join us on this journey through the Australian Outback, where every sunrise promises the possibility of redemption, and every sunset whispers of love that refuses to surrender to hardship. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever found hope in the places where you least expected it? And if this tale has touched something in your own heart, let others know by showing your support. For in the vast spaces of this ancient continent, every story of courage and compassion makes the world a little less lonely, a little more filled with grace.
Chapter 2. The Healing Hours. Dawn came slowly to the outback,
painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and gold that reminded Maggie of the inside of the abalone shells her grandmother had collected from distant beaches. She awakened on her own couch, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of a hand-knitted blanket she didn't remember owning and the sound of quiet movement in her kitchen. The events of the previous day returned in fragments. The collapsed fence, the terrible moment when her strength had finally failed her, and then the stranger's face hovering above her with eyes the colour of storm clouds. Jack Sullivan. The name carried weight in this part of the territory, she realised now. She'd heard David mention him over the years, always with the grudging respect one stockman reserved for another who understood the demands of the land. She sat up carefully, testing her body's responses. The dizziness was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that felt different from simple fatigue. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been running on empty for too long, like a windmill grinding through a drought until its gears finally seized. "You're awake." Jack's voice came from the kitchen doorway, and she turned to see him standing there with 2 steaming cups in his hands. He looked different in the morning light, less like the angel of mercy who had materialized out of heat shimmer, an ordinary man dealing with an extraordinary situation. His hair was grey at the temples, his face deeply lined by sun and wind, and there was something in his careful posture that spoke of a man who'd learnt not to expect too much from life. "I made coffee," he said, approaching slowly as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth despite the morning heat already building outside. The coffee was strong and black, made the way station people learned to drink it, fuel rather than pleasure, sustenance for the long hours that lay ahead. "You stayed the night," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. Jack settled into David's old chair across from her, his movements economical and precise. "Didn't seem right to leave you alone after what happened yesterday. Heat exhaustion can have delayed effects, confusion, weakness. You could have fallen, hurt yourself further." There was something carefully neutral in his voice, as if he were explaining his presence to himself as much as to her. Maggie studied his face over the rim of her coffee cup, noting the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested a man uncomfortable with intimacy of any kind.
"Thank you," she said simply, and watched him relax fractionally at the simplicity of her acceptance. Outside, the kookaburras were beginning their morning chorus, their laughter echoing across the red earth like a reminder that joy could still exist in harsh places. Jack listened to the sound with the absorbed attention of a man who had learned to read the bush like others read newspapers. Every bird call, every shift in the wind carrying information about weather, water, and the 1,000 small signs that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. "I checked on your cattle again at first light. They're fine, but that break in the fence needs attention. If you tell me where you keep your tools, I can make the repair before the heat gets too bad." Maggie felt something twist inside her chest. Not quite pain, but not comfort either. It had been so long since someone had offered to share the burden of station work that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have help freely given. David, in the months before his departure, had grown increasingly resentful of the endless maintenance that station life demanded, muttering about being too old for fence repairs and cattle work, as if age were a betrayal rather than an achievement. "You don't have to do that," she said carefully. "It's not your responsibility."
Jack was quiet for a moment, staring out through the window at the landscape beginning to shimmer with heat. In country like this, responsibility is a luxury we can't always afford. Sometimes we just do what needs doing because it needs doing. The words hung between them, simple and profound as the morning light slanting through the windows. Maggie realized she was seeing something rare, a man who understood that true strength wasn't about independence, but about knowing when to offer help and when to accept it. The tool shed is behind the house. Green door, combination lock. The numbers are 1923. The year David's grandfather first claimed this land. Jack nodded and stood, but instead of heading immediately outside, he lingered in the doorway. "Before I go, when was the last time you had a proper meal? Not just coffee and toast, but actual food?" The question caught her off guard, and she realized she couldn't remember. The days since David's departure had blurred together in a haze of grief and survival, with eating becoming just another chore to be endured rather than enjoyed. "There's not much in the house," she admitted. "I haven't made it to town for supplies in—" She trailed off, unwilling to admit how long it had been since she had felt capable of facing other people, their questions and their sympathy. "I've got supplies at my place. Fresh bread, eggs from my chickens, some vegetables from the garden. If you're feeling up to it later, maybe you could come over for a proper meal. Nothing fancy, just food that'll put some strength back in you." The invitation was offered with the same careful neutrality he had used to explain staying the night, but Maggie heard something underneath it, a loneliness that matched her own perhaps, or simply the recognition that isolation could become its own kind of trap if allowed to continue too long. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Jack smiled then, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him, and she caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever sorrows had driven him to seek solitude in the heart of the continent. "Good," he said simply, then headed outside to begin work on the fence. Through the window, Maggie watched him stride across the yard towards the tool shed, his movements sure and purposeful. He was a big man, she realized, with the kind of build that came from years of physical labor rather than gymnasium exercise. His hands, when he had tended to her the night before, had been gentle despite their obvious strength, the hands of someone accustomed to caring for vulnerable things.
She found herself wondering about his story, about what had brought him to this remote corner of the territory and kept him here for 15 years, with only his cattle and his solitude for company. In country where everyone knew everyone else's business, the fact that Jack Sullivan remained something of a mystery spoke to either a deliberate choice or a past too painful to share easily. The sound of hammering began from the direction of the boundary fence, a steady rhythm that spoke of competent work being done without fuss or ceremony. Maggie finished her coffee and made her way slowly to the kitchen, testing her balance with each step. The weakness was still there, but manageable now, more like recovering from illness than the desperate exhaustion that had felled her the day before. In the kitchen, she discovered evidence of Jack's quiet care throughout the night. The dishes from her meager dinner 2 nights ago had been washed and put away. Fresh water filled the containers she used for drinking and cooking. Even her small herb garden had been watered, the mint and parsley showing new signs of life despite the relentless heat.
These small acts of service, performed without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, moved her more than any grand gesture might have. They spoke of a man who understood that care was often expressed not in words, but in actions, not in promises, but in the quiet assumption of another person's burdens. She spent the morning slowly, moving through the house like someone relearning familiar territory after a long absence. In David's study, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through windows he had always meant to clean. His books still lined the shelves, volumes on cattle breeding and drought management, station histories and weather pattern studies that had been his passion before disappointment had soured him on the dreams that had once sustained them both. On his desk, the note he had left still lay where she had dropped it after reading, the paper already curling at the edges from the dry heat. She picked it up now and read it again, looking for clues she might have missed, some explanation that would make sense of a lifetime's partnership dissolved in a dozen hastily scrawled words. But there was nothing more to find. Just the bold statement of a man who had decided he could no longer bear the weight of his own choices, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten that love, once given, created obligations that couldn't be simply abandoned. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer with other documents she wasn't ready to deal with. Insurance papers, bank statements, the accumulated paperwork of a life that would now need to be rebuilt from the foundation up. Someday she would need to face the practical realities of her situation, but not today. Today there was the simple miracle of having survived another dawn and the unexpected gift of not facing it entirely alone. The hammering from the fence line had stopped, replaced by the distant sound of Jack calling to cattle. She made her way to the front veranda and settled into the old wooden chair that had been her favorite spot for watching sunsets with David in the early years of their marriage, back when they still talked about their dreams and their plans for the future. There had been a sweetness to those years that she had almost forgotten in the bitter aftermath of recent disappointments. But seeing Jack's calm competence with her cattle stirred memories of what it felt like to work alongside someone who shared her understanding of the land and its demands. For the first time in months, she felt something other than grief or exhaustion, a stirring of interest in the world beyond her own sorrow, a curiosity about this man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. By midday, when the heat had grown too intense for outdoor work, Jack returned to the house with the easy stride of someone satisfied with honest labor completed. His shirt was dark with sweat, and dust had settled into the lines around his eyes, giving him the look of someone who belonged to this landscape as naturally as the ghost gums and the wedgie eagles. "Fence is secure," he reported, settling onto the veranda steps with a grunt of satisfaction. "And I had a look at your generator while I was at it. You've got a fuel leak that's going to need attention soon, but it should hold for a while longer." Maggie brought him a glass of cold water from her dwindling supply, grateful for the excuse to do something useful. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, but her protest lacked conviction. The relief of having these problems addressed by competent hands was too great to hide behind false independence. "Told you before," Jack said, accepting the water gratefully. "Sometimes we just do what needs doing."
They sat in comfortable silence as the heat pressed down around them like a living thing. In the distance, The land shimmered with mirages that transformed the red earth into lakes of impossible blue. Reminders that in the outback, reality was always negotiable and hope could take the most unlikely forms. "Tell me about your place," Maggie said eventually, curious about the man who had become her unexpected savior. "How long have you been out here?" Jack was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of stories long held in silence. 15 years last month, he said. Bought the property from the Hendersons when they decided station life was too hard for their retirement years. It was pretty run down when I got it. Fences falling, infrastructure failing, the kind of place that breaks dreams if you're not careful. He paused, staring out at the heat-shimmering distance as if seeing not the present landscape, but the past that had brought him to this place. I needed somewhere to disappear for a while, somewhere I could work hard enough to stop thinking about things I couldn't change. The land gave me that, work so demanding that it didn't leave room for much else. There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakable to someone who had learned to recognize the sound of a heart protecting itself from further damage. Maggie understood instinctively that he was offering her something precious, not the full story of his past perhaps, but enough trust to let her know that she wasn't the only one who had needed refuge from life's disappointments. "Did it work?" she asked gently. "The not thinking?" Jack smiled ruefully. "For a while. Amazing how much of yourself you can bury under honest exhaustion. But the land has its own wisdom about these things. Eventually, it stops letting you hide and starts demanding that you live again instead of just surviving." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Maggie felt something stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. For so long, survival had been her only goal, each day measured simply by her ability to reach its end without surrendering to the despair that lurked at the edges of her consciousness. But sitting here with Jack, listening to his quiet wisdom about the land's demands and the necessity of living rather than merely enduring, she began to wonder if there might be more to the future than she had dared to imagine. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of heat and possibility. Soon Jack would return to his own property and his own work, and she would once again be alone with her thoughts and her memories. But something had shifted in the space between them, some recognition that solitude, while sometimes necessary, need not be permanent. "That invitation to dinner," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Does it still stand?" Jack turned to look at her, and she saw something kindle in his storm-grey eyes, surprise perhaps, or satisfaction that his offer had been accepted. "It stands," he said simply. "I was hoping you'd say yes." And in that moment, as the outback sun climbed towards its merciless zenith and the red earth baked beneath an endless sky, Maggie O'Brien began to understand that rescue could take many forms, that sometimes salvation came not as dramatic intervention, but as the quiet offering of companionship, the simple promise that tomorrow might hold something more than mere survival. The healing had begun, as gentle and persistent as desert rain soaking into thirsty ground, carrying with it the possibility that even hearts scorched by betrayal could learn to bloom again under the right conditions.
In the harsh beauty of the Australian Outback, where the sun tests every living thing and the land demands everything from those who love it, two wounded souls are discovering that healing often begins with the simplest gestures: a cup of coffee shared, a fence mended, an invitation offered with quiet hope. Sometimes the most profound journeys begin not with grand declarations, but with small acts of kindness, with the recognition that we are not meant to face life's challenges entirely alone. Jack and Maggie are learning this truth as the desert teaches its ancient lessons about endurance, resilience, and the unexpected places where love can take root. If this story resonates with your own understanding of second chances and the healing power of human connection, we invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to hear more tales from the Red Heart of Australia, where every sunrise brings new possibilities and every act of compassion ripples outward like water in a drought-stricken land. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever found healing in unexpected places? Your stories make our community richer, reminding us that hope, like the hardy plants of the outback, can flourish even in the harshest conditions.
Chapter 3: Shadows and Light. Jack Sullivan's homestead sat in a natural depression between two low ridges, positioned to catch the morning breeze and sheltered from the worst of the afternoon heat by a stand of ancient river-red gums that spoke of underground water and careful planning. As Maggie walked beside him along the dusty track that connected their properties, she found herself seeing the landscape through fresh eyes. Not just as the harsh testing ground it had become in recent months, but as the living, breathing entity that had shaped generations of lives and dreams. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the red earth in shades of copper and gold that reminded her why she had fallen in love with this country in the first place. The heat was still formidable, but there was a quality to the late afternoon light that softened the harsh edges, making even the most unforgiving terrain seem touched with grace. "How far back does your water go?" she asked, noting the green that persisted around Jack's buildings despite the drought that had withered so much else. "Bore goes down nearly 200 meters, he replied, his pride in the accomplishment evident in his voice. "Cost me 3 years' worth of cattle money to sink it properly, but it's been the difference between survival and prosperity. Previous owners tried to make do with surface tanks and seasonal creeks. Works fine until the drought years, then everything falls apart." Maggie nodded, understanding the harsh mathematics of outback life, where water was more precious than gold and far more essential. David had always talked about sinking a proper bore, but somehow there had never been enough money or enough time, always some more immediate crisis that demanded attention and resources. David always meant to... She began, then stopped, surprised by the casual way her husband's name had slipped into conversation. For weeks, she had barely been able to think about him without feeling the sharp edge of betrayal. But walking here in the gentle evening light beside a man who understood the challenges David had faced, she found herself able to speak of him without the immediate rush of pain and anger. "It's a hard choice," Jack said quietly, understanding her unfinished thought. "The bore or the new truck? Better fencing or repairs to the house? Always something demanding attention, never quite enough resources to address everything that needs addressing." There was no judgment in his voice, only the recognition of someone who had faced similar decisions and understood how easily good intentions could be overwhelmed by immediate necessity. For the first time since David's departure, Maggie felt something other than betrayal when thinking of her husband, a flicker of the compassion that had once sustained their partnership through the inevitable failures and disappointments of station life. Jack's house, when it came into view, surprised her with its thoughtful design and careful maintenance. Unlike the weathered pragmatism of most outback dwellings, this homestead showed evidence of someone who had invested not just in survival, but in creating a space where life could be lived with dignity and even comfort. The building itself was modest, a traditional single-story structure with deep verandas and thick stone walls designed to provide refuge from the extremes of heat and cold. But the details spoke of care and attention.
the vegetable garden protected by shade cloth and mulched with composted cattle manure, the chicken coop positioned to catch the morning sun while providing afternoon shade, the workshop where tools hung in neat rows and every piece of equipment showed signs of regular maintenance. "It's beautiful," Maggie said, and meant it. This was what their own place might have looked like if they had possessed Jack's discipline and patience, his willingness to invest in long-term solutions rather than quick fixes. "Took me the better part of 10 years to get it right," Jack admitted, leading her up the front steps onto a veranda where comfortable chairs waited in the shade of a vine-covered trellis. "Made plenty of mistakes along the way, but that's how you learn what works and what doesn't in country like this." The interior of the house continued the theme of thoughtful simplicity. The rooms were sparsely furnished, but comfortable, with practical surfaces that could withstand the dust and heat of outback life while maintaining an atmosphere of calm refuge. Books lined shelves built into the thick stone walls, and she noted titles on subjects ranging from sustainable agriculture to Aboriginal land management. Evidence of a mind that remained curious about the world despite choosing isolation from much of it. In the kitchen, Jack moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to providing for himself, setting water to boil for tea while checking the progress of what appeared to be a substantial stew simmering on the stove. The aroma that filled the air made Maggie's mouth water, rich and complex, speaking of ingredients allowed to develop their flavors slowly over time.
"Beef from my own cattle," Jack explained, noticing her interest. "Vegetables from the garden, herbs I dry myself. Not fancy cooking, but it's filling, and it tastes like food rather than something manufactured in a factory." He poured tea into 2 heavy ceramic mugs and led her back onto the veranda, where the evening breeze was beginning to provide relief from the day's heat. They settled into chairs, positioned to catch the breeze while maintaining a view of the landscape stretching away toward the distant ranges, a vista that never failed to remind observers of their place in something vastly larger than individual concerns. "May I ask you something?" Maggie said, accepting her tea gratefully. "You don't have to answer if it's too personal, but I'm curious about what brought you out here. You mentioned needing somewhere to disappear for a while." Jack was quiet for so long she thought he might decline to answer, but finally he began to speak in the careful cadence of someone sharing a story that had been kept private for years. "I was married once," Jack said, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. 23 years to a woman who understood my work, but never really understood me. Or maybe I never understood her. Hard to say, looking back." He paused to sip his tea, gathering the threads of a narrative that still carried the power to cause pain. "Sarah wanted the security that came with my job. I was a regional agriculture advisor. Good salary, steady work, respected in the community. But she never wanted the man who needed to be out in the paddocks before dawn, who came home covered in dust and talking about rainfall patterns and soil composition." Maggie listened without interruption, recognizing the familiar cadence of a marriage that had slowly lost its way, the gradual erosion of connection that could happen so subtly that the end came as a shock, despite years of warning signs. "The final break came when I suggested we buy a small property of our own. Nothing grand, just enough land to run some cattle and maybe grow our own food. She said she hadn't married me to live like a pioneer, that she deserved better than a life of dust and isolation." The words hung between them, heavy with old pain and the kind of fundamental incompatibility that no amount of goodwill could bridge. Maggie understood the particular heartbreak of discovering that the person you loved most in the world didn't love the same version of yourself that you held most dear. She wasn't wrong exactly, Jack said with the fairness that came from years of reflection. She had married one version of me and I was asking her to accept another, but I couldn't be the man she wanted me to be, and she couldn't be happy with the man I actually was. "So you came out here," Maggie said gently. "So I came out here. Bought this place with my share of the divorce settlement and spent the first 5 years working myself into exhaustion. Figured if I couldn't make my marriage work, at least I could make the land productive." He smiled ruefully at the memory. "Nearly killed myself that first summer trying to fence the entire eastern boundary in February heat. Had to learn the hard way that the land sets its own pace and punishes anyone foolish enough to argue with it." There was something in his story that resonated deeply with Maggie's own experience of marriage and loss, though the details were different. The fundamental challenge remained the same: how to maintain authentic connection with another person when life's pressures and disappointments conspired to erode the very foundations on which that connection had been built.
"Do you regret it?" she asked. "The choice to come out here, I mean." Jack considered the question seriously, his gaze moving across the landscape that had become his world. There were times, especially in the early years, when the loneliness felt like it might kill me. Times when I wondered if I'd traded one form of misery for another. He turned to look at her directly, his storm-grey eyes holding a depth of understanding that made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. But then I'd have mornings when I'd walk out onto the veranda and see the sun coming up over the ranges, or evenings when the whole world seemed painted in gold and red, and I'd realize that I was exactly where I needed to be. That sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most honest lives. The honesty of his words, the willingness to share both regret and acceptance, moved Maggie more than any attempt at comfort might have. Here was someone who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting pain, but about integrating it into a larger understanding of what life could offer those brave enough to remain open to possibility. As if summoned by their conversation about solitude and connection, a small commotion erupted from the direction of the chicken coop. Jack rose immediately, his body language shifting from relaxed conversation to alert competence, and Maggie followed him as he strode across the yard toward the disturbance. A dingo had somehow managed to get into the chicken enclosure despite Jack's careful construction, and was now trapped inside with a dozen thoroughly outraged hens. The wild dog was clearly more frightened than aggressive, darting back and forth as the chickens dive-bombed it with the fearless fury that only domestic fowl could muster in defense of their territory. "Poor bastard," Jack muttered, moving to open the gate that would allow the dingo to escape, probably just looking for water, and got more than he bargained for. The scene was almost comical. The lean wild dog desperately seeking escape while being hectored by birds a tenth its size. But Maggie found herself moved by Jack's immediate compassion for a creature that most station owners would have shot without hesitation. Dingoes were considered vermin by many, threats to cattle and chickens that needed to be eliminated on sight. Jack, however, simply opened the gate and stepped aside, allowing the grateful animal to bolt for freedom while keeping himself between the dingo and Maggie. The wild dog paused at the edge of the yard to look back once, as if to acknowledge the unexpected mercy, before disappearing into the gathering dusk. "You didn't try to kill it," Maggie observed, surprised by her own surprise. "No point,"
replied Jack, checking his chickens for any sign of injury. He wasn't really hunting, just desperate for water. Drive them off and they usually don't come back. Kill them and their pack mates will keep testing your defenses until one of them succeeds. The practical wisdom of his approach impressed her, but it was the underlying compassion that stayed with her as they returned to the veranda. Here was a man who had learned to live in harmony with the harsh realities of outback life without becoming harsh himself, who could defend what needed defending while still showing mercy to creatures driven by their own desperation. The evening meal that followed was simple but satisfying in ways that had nothing to do with the food itself. They ate by lamplight as the generator hummed quietly in the background, the conversation flowing easily between topics both practical and personal. Jack spoke about his cattle breeding program and his experiments with drought-resistant pasture grasses. Maggie found herself talking about the garden she had always dreamed of creating, the native plants she wanted to encourage around the homestead boundaries. It was the kind of conversation she hadn't shared with anyone in years, forward-looking, full of plans and possibilities, rather than focused on problems and disappointments. For the first time since David's departure, she found herself thinking beyond mere survival to what kind of life she might actually want to build from the ruins of her marriage. But as the evening deepened and the Southern Cross began its nightly journey across the star-filled sky, shadows began to intrude on the gentle peace they had created. Sitting here, in the lamplit comfort of Jack's veranda, sharing food and stories with a man who seemed to understand her in ways David never had, Maggie felt the familiar stir of guilt and confusion that accompanied any moment of happiness in the aftermath of loss.
Was she betraying her marriage vows by enjoying another man's company? Did finding comfort in Jack's presence mean she was somehow complicit in David's decision to abandon their life together? The questions had no easy answers, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's conditioning about loyalty and appropriate behavior for a woman of her age and circumstances. Jack seemed to sense her shifting mood, the way her responses became more cautious and her smiles more forced. When she began to make excuses about needing to return home before it got too late, he didn't argue or try to convince her to stay. Instead, he simply packed the leftover stew into containers for her to take home, refusing her protestations that she couldn't accept charity. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's neighbors looking out for neighbors. Besides, I made too much, and I hate to see good food go to waste." The walk back to her homestead took place mostly in comfortable silence, their footsteps synchronized as they navigated the familiar track by starlight. The night air carried the mixed scents of dust and hardy desert plants, the occasional call of a nightbird punctuating the vast quiet that was one of the Outback's greatest gifts to those who learned to appreciate it. At her front gate, Jack paused, clearly weighing whether to say something more or simply bid her good night. Finally, he spoke with the careful deliberation of someone choosing his words precisely. "Maggie," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice carried a weight that made her look up into his face. "I want you to know that whatever you're feeling right now, guilt, confusion, worry about what's appropriate or what people might think, it's normal. Healing isn't a straight line, and there's no timeline that makes sense to anyone but yourself." She felt tears prick her eyes at the gentleness in his voice, the way he had somehow understood the internal struggle she hadn't known how to articulate. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than they could possibly hold. "For everything, for saving my life, for fixing my fence, for reminding me that good food shared with good company is one of life's greatest pleasures." Jack reached out as if to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it, letting his own hand fall back to his side. "The invitation stands whenever you need it. Good neighbors shouldn't be strangers, and we've been strangers long enough." With that, he
He turned and began the walk back to his own property, leaving Maggie standing at her gate with her heart full of contradictions and her mind spinning with possibilities she wasn't sure she was brave enough to explore. The leftover stew in her hands still held the warmth of his kitchen and the memory of conversation that had nourished more than just her body. Inside her empty house, the silence felt different than it had before, less like abandonment and more like potential. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness for weeks now seemed to hold space for new possibilities, new ways of being that she was only beginning to imagine. That night, for the first time since David's departure, Maggie fell asleep not to the sound of her own tears, but to the memory of laughter shared across a dinner table, of stories exchanged in the gentle evening light, of a man's quiet voice assuring her that healing was possible even for hearts that felt permanently broken. In her dreams, the red earth bloomed with wildflowers that had waited for years of drought for the right conditions to emerge, and the Southern Cross wheeled overhead like a benediction, blessing all those brave enough to believe in second chances.
Chapter 4. Where the Heart Finds Home. 3 weeks had passed since that first evening at Jack's homestead. 3 weeks that had established a rhythm as natural as the daily arc of the sun across the endless sky. Each morning brought new reasons for the two neighbours to cross the invisible boundary between their properties. A broken water pipe that needed an extra pair of hands, cattle that had wandered through a gap in the fence, or simply the comfortable excuse of sharing morning coffee before the day's heat became too intense. Maggie found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. The hollow-eyed woman who had collapsed from exhaustion and despair was gradually being replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow. Her appetite had returned, along with her interest in the small projects that gave station life its purpose and meaning. The herb garden that had withered during her darkest days now showed signs of careful tending. And she had even begun planning improvements to the homestead that went beyond mere maintenance. But it was in the quiet moments between tasks, in the conversations that stretched long into the evening hours, that the most significant changes were taking place. Jack Sullivan was proving to be more than just a capable neighbour and generous friend. He was becoming the companion she hadn't known she was searching for, the missing piece that made the puzzle of her life complete in ways she was only beginning to understand. On this particular morning, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon with the promise of the season's first substantial rain, Maggie made a decision that it would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. She was going to ask Jack to help her clear out David's study, to pack away the remnants of her marriage and make space for whatever future might be waiting beyond the long shadow of abandonment. The task had loomed before her like an insurmountable mountain since David's departure, too laden with memory and pain to approach alone. But the thought of Jack's steady presence, his quiet understanding of the need to honour the past while not being imprisoned by it, gave her the courage to finally face what needed to be done. She found him in his workshop, bent over a piece of farm equipment with the focused concentration she had come to admire in all his undertakings. "Jack," she said from the doorway, and something in her voice made him look up immediately, his hands stilling on the wrench he had been using. "What is it?" he asked, rising to his full height with the fluid movement of someone whose body remained strong despite the passage of years. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Maggie replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "In a way, I suppose I have. I need to ask you a favor, and it's not a small one." He wiped his hands on a clean rag and gave her his complete attention, the quality of listening that she had learnt to treasure in their growing friendship. "Whatever you need," he said simply, and she felt the familiar flatter of gratitude at his willingness to offer help without first counting the cost. "I need to clear out David's study," she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if speed might make them easier to bear. "I've been putting it off, but with the wet season coming, I need to deal with his papers, his books, all the evidence of a life that's over." Jack was quiet for a moment, understanding instinctively the magnitude of what she was asking. This wasn't just about moving furniture or organizing documents. It was about performing the final ritual of a marriage's end, about making peace with the ghost of a relationship that had once been the organizing principle of her entire existence. "When do you want to start?" he asked, and the simple acceptance in his voice nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Now," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "Before I lose my nerve."
The walk back to her homestead took place in companionable silence, but Maggie was acutely aware of Jack's presence beside her, the solid reality of his support giving her strength for what lay ahead. The storm clouds were building higher now, great towering monuments to the sky's power that promised either salvation or destruction, depending on how the wind chose to blow. David's study, when they entered it together, seemed smaller than she remembered, diminished by the dust motes dancing in the filtered sunlight and the faint smell of neglect that had begun to permeate the unused space. The books still lined their shelves in neat rows, the desk still held the accumulated paperwork of a station owner's daily concerns, and the photographs still smiled down from their frames, images of better days when the future had seemed filled with possibility rather than shadowed by disappointment. "Where do you want to start?" Jack asked gently, his eyes taking in the magnitude of the task before them. Maggie moved to the desk first, her hands hovering over the surface where David had spent countless hours planning their lives together, making the calculations and projections that had sustained their dreams through the inevitable setbacks that station life brought. The note he had left still lay in the top drawer where she had placed it weeks ago, but its power to wound her had diminished under the healing influence of Jack's friendship and her own slowly returning strength. "The papers first," she said decisively. "I need to know what's important and what can be discarded. Then the books, and finally..." Her voice trailed off as she gaze fell on a particular photograph. Their wedding picture, taken 40 years ago in the garden of her parents' home in Adelaide. The young couple smiling back at her seemed like strangers now, their faces bright with the confidence of people who believed that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle life might place in their path. Jack noticed her stillness and moved to stand beside her, his presence an anchor in the storm of memory and regret that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. "He wasn't always the man who left that note," she said quietly, picking up the photograph with hands that trembled only slightly. "There was a time when he would have died rather than abandon me to face life alone." "What changed?" Jack asked, the question offered with the gentleness of someone who understood that sometimes the hardest truths were the ones that needed most to be spoken. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces in the photograph as if they might offer some explanation for the trajectory that had led from such bright beginning to such bitter end. "I think we forgot to see each other," she said finally. "We got so caught up in the daily struggle to make the station profitable, to survive the droughts and the market downturns and all the thousand small crises that station life brings, that we stopped seeing the people we were becoming and started seeing only the problems we couldn't solve." She set the photograph aside, not throwing it away, but placing it with the items that would need more careful consideration. "The last few years were especially hard," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke truths that had been locked inside her for too long. The drought, the cattle prices, the constant worry about money and the future. David began to see every morning as just another day of fighting a losing battle, and I began to see him as part of the problem rather than my partner in solving it.
Jack listened without judgment, understanding that she was not just sorting through David's possessions, but through the complex legacy of their life together. The love that was real, the disappointments that were equally real, and the slow erosion of connection that could happen even between people who had once promised to love each other forever. They worked steadily through the morning, creating careful piles of documents to be kept, papers to be shredded, books to be donated to the small library in the nearest town. With each item handled and decision made, Maggie felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Not the weight of memory, but the weight of unfinished business, of tasks delayed by grief and fear. Jack proved to be more than just physical help in the sorting process. His quiet questions about the significance of various items helped her think through what truly mattered and what was simply clutter accumulated over years of married life. He handled David's possessions with respect, never rushing her decisions or suggesting what she should or shouldn't keep.
It was when they reached the bottom drawer of David's desk that they found the letters. There were perhaps 24 of them, bound with a faded ribbon and stored beneath a collection of old station records. Maggie recognized her own handwriting immediately. Letters she had written to David during their courtship, when he had been working on a station 300 kilometers away, and their entire relationship had been conducted through the post and the occasional precious weekend visit. "I thought he had thrown these away years ago," she whispered, her fingers tracing the familiar loops and curves of her younger self's handwriting. Jack stepped back, understanding instinctively that this was a moment that belonged to her alone. She opened the first letter, dated nearly 45 years ago, and began to read words written by a woman who believed in forever and happy endings. "My dearest David, your letter arrived this morning, and I must have read it 12 times already. To think that in just 2 more months you'll be finished with your contract, and we can finally be together always. I've been walking around the house all day with such a foolish smile that Mother asked if I'd taken leave of my senses." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness alone. Mixed with the grief for what had been was a profound gratitude for what had once been real, the love that had brought them together, the dreams they had shared, and the genuine partnership that had sustained them through the early years of their marriage. "He kept them," she said wonderingly, looking up at Jack through her tears. "Through all the disappointments, all the times when we could barely stand to be in the same room together, he kept every letter I ever wrote to him." The discovery changed something fundamental in how she understood the end of her marriage. David's departure, which had seemed like the casual cruelty of a man who had simply stopped caring, now revealed itself as the desperate act of someone who had cared too much to watch their love continue its slow death by 1,000 small cuts. The letters went into the pile of things to be kept, along with a few photographs and some books that had particular significance. Most of David's possessions would find new homes or be donated to people who could use them, but these remnants of their love story would remain, not as shrines to a failed marriage, but as honest acknowledgements of what had once been beautiful and true. By afternoon, the study had been transformed from a monument to abandonment into a clean, empty space ready for whatever future might require it. The storm clouds that had been building all morning finally opened, releasing the season's first substantial rain in sheets that drummed against the windows and filled the air with the rich scent of wet earth. They stood together on the veranda, watching the water soak into ground that had been waiting months for this blessing. The rain fell with the kind of intensity that promised real relief from drought, the kind of downpour that could transform the landscape almost overnight from brown survival to green abundance. "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice almost lost in the sound of rain on the corrugated iron roof. Jack turned to look at her, his storm-grey eyes reflecting something deeper than friendship, something that made her heart skip in a way that it hadn't for decades. "Maggie," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that made her breath catch in her throat. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear me out before you decide how to respond." The rain continued its steady rhythm as he gathered his thoughts, choosing words with the same careful precision he brought to every important task. "When I found you collapsed by that fence 3 weeks ago, I thought I was just helping a neighbor in trouble. But these past weeks, getting to know you, sharing meals and conversations, and watching you find your strength again, I've realized that you've saved me as much as I saved you." He paused, studying her face for any sign of how his words were being received. "I've been alone for 15 years. Not just living alone, but truly alone in ways that were slowly killing everything soft and hopeful in me. You've brought that back to life, made me remember what it feels like to care about someone else's happiness as much as my own." The words hung between them like the rain that connected earth and sky, and Maggie felt her heart opening to possibilities she thought were buried forever with her marriage. "Are you saying," she began, then stopped, afraid to complete the thought. "I'm saying that I love you," Jack said simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found his truth and was brave enough to speak it. The rain seemed to pause as she processed his words, her mind reeling between the woman who had been abandoned by her husband just weeks ago and the woman who now stood on the threshold of a different kind of future. "I love you too," she heard herself say, the words emerging from some deep place she hadn't known still existed. Jack stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup her face with the gentleness she had come to associate with all his gestures. "Are you sure? Because this isn't just about comfort or gratitude or fear of being alone. This is about choosing to build a life together, about taking the risk that two people who've been hurt before can still create something beautiful."
In response, Maggie rose on her toes and kissed him, tasting rain and hope and the promise of tomorrow on his lips. The kiss was everything their tentative friendship had been building toward. Gentle but passionate, familiar yet thrilling, the connection of two souls who had found their way to each other through the vast loneliness of the world. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces wet with rain and tears of joy. "Yes," Maggie whispered against his cheek. "Yes to all of it. Yes to taking risks and building something new and trusting that love is possible even at our age, even after everything we've both been through." They stood together in the rain, two people who had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures began not with bold departures, but with the courage to remain open to unexpected arrivals. Around them, the red earth drank deeply of the blessing from the sky, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly as they grazed on grass that had waited through months of drought to finally emerge. That evening, as the storm moved east and the stars began to appear between the departing clouds, Jack and Maggie sat together on her veranda, planning a future that would honor both their pasts and their newfound love. They spoke of combining their properties, of the children and grandchildren they hoped would visit the station they would build together, of growing old in the place that had brought them together. But mostly they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the Southern Cross wheel overhead and listening to the sound of water dripping from the eaves, the music of the Outback blessing those brave enough to call it home, strong enough to endure its tests, and wise enough to recognize that sometimes the most profound gifts come disguised as the most ordinary miracles. In the harsh beauty of Australia's red centre, where the sun tests every living thing and the land demands everything from those who love it, two wounded hearts had discovered that rescue could indeed take many forms. Sometimes it came as dramatic intervention, but sometimes it came as quiet companionship, as shared meals and mended fences, as the gradual recognition that love, like the hardy plants of the desert, could bloom even in the harshest conditions if tended with patience and care. The Outback had claimed another story, but this time it was one of redemption rather than loss, of love discovered rather than dreams abandoned. And in the vast silence of the continent's heart, where stars shine with prehistoric brilliance and every dawn promises the possibility of transformation, Jack Sullivan and Margaret O'Brien began the next chapter of their lives, together. And so we come to the end of this journey through the heart of Australia, where two souls wounded by life's disappointments discovered that healing often wears the face of unexpected love, and that sometimes our greatest challenges become the pathways to our most profound blessings. In the red center of this ancient continent, where the land teaches patience to all who will listen, and where every sunrise offers the possibility of redemption, Jack and Maggie have found what we all hope exists somewhere in the vast mystery of our own futures. A love strong enough to heal old wounds, brave enough to risk new beginnings, and deep enough to transform the loneliest places into gardens of hope. Their story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, never too late to open our hearts to the possibility that tomorrow might hold something more beautiful than we dared to imagine. In a world that often feels fractured and uncertain, tales like theirs shine like beacons in the darkness, whispering that love, real, lasting, transformative love, remains possible for those courageous enough to remain open to its arrival. If this story has touched something in your own heart, if it has reminded you that hope can bloom even in the harshest conditions, then we invite you to carry its message forward. Subscribe to join our community of believers in second chances and the healing power of human connection. Share your own stories of unexpected love and hard-won wisdom in the comments below. For every tale of triumph over adversity adds another star to the constellation of hope that guides us all. Like the Southern Cross that wheels eternally overhead, watching over all who dare to love in this beautiful, challenging world, may your own story be one of resilience, compassion, and the courage to believe that the best chapters of our lives might still be waiting to be written. In the vast heart of Australia, where every story is possible and every heart can find its home, love continues to work its ancient magic, patient as the desert, enduring as the ranges, and infinite as the sky that embraces them both.